Well, this morning I want to take a few moments in Mark's Gospel, Mark chapter 4, to share with you a message that speaks to all of us. Maybe not right now in your life, but at some point something has occurred in your life and it has given you the impression, or it has given you the idea that maybe God was missing in that situation. And if something came into your life, you struggled, you had a dire situation occur in your life, you lost a loved one, something happened, you struggled with a relationship, you had some serious matter and some test of your faith came into your life, and it just seemed like God was not there for you. It just seemed like He wasn't present this morning. And I want to share with you a message from Mark chapter 4 called Asleep in the Boat. As we see this morning how the disciples had to negotiate with their own fear in the midst of a literal storm that they were in. How they doubted the power of God in the presence of Jesus. How they feared for their lives, and how their greatest concern was that Jesus was asleep in the boat. And this morning we can see, as we study here in Mark chapter 4, that God allows you and allows me to have these situations because there's great lesson for us to deepen our faith, to deepen the trust that we have in Him when it seems as if God is missing in the situation. Mark chapter 4, beginning in verse 35. That day when evening came, He said to His disciples, "Let us go over to the other side." Leaving the crowd behind, they took Him along just as He was in the boat. There were also other boats with Him. A furious squall came up, and the waves broke over the boat so that it was nearly swamped. Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion. The disciples woke Him and said to Him, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" He got up, rebuked the wind, and said to the waves, "Quiet, be still." Then the wind died down, and it was completely calm. He said to His disciples, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" They were terrified and asked each other, "Who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey Him." Now, just as we have read, this by no means was an unordinary day in the lives of Jesus and His followers. The Sea of Galilee was no stranger to these men. Several of the disciples came to follow Jesus from the trade of being a fisherman. So being on the Sea of Galilee would not have been unusual. They would have been on that water many times. They would have fished in the evenings, and they would fish in the daytime, and then at times this body of water, which is not necessarily a large body of water, the sea is 13 miles long at its longest, 8 miles wide at its widest, and where our text finds these men today, they are about 5 miles across. So they're about in the middle of the Sea of Galilee. Now the reason, and I have a picture of what the Sea of Galilee would look like, the reason that this happens is, in just a moment you'll see what I mean, the Sea of Galilee is surrounded by mountains. And what happens from a weather standpoint is the wind comes down over these mountains, and the Sea of Galilee is kind of in this bowl configuration you see in that photo on the screen. So the wind comes down and swirls among these mountains and creates very treacherous waters for such a small body of water. So this morning I want us to look at this storm, this literal storm that the disciples had gone through. They have been with Jesus now for a while. And they've seen Jesus do many, many things. Just like you and me. We've had relationships with God now for a while. And then when storms come up, it's very easy for us to doubt His presence. It's very easy for us to ask Him where He is. Where are you when the situation is bad? We're realizing through the study of this text this morning that God will allow you and allow me to go through times of difficulty, to go through struggles, because there is something that we need from that experience this morning. So I want us to consider a few things this morning from this text. First, let's consider the storm's rage. The storm's rage. In verses 37 and 38, a furious squall came up, and the waves broke over the boat so that it was nearly swamped. This would not have been a small boat. It was large enough to hold 13 men, so it was not a small boat. But for it to be nearly swamped means that the water was coming over on the sides of the boat. It was filling up with water almost to the point that it was about to sink. And in verse 38, where do they find Jesus? Verse 38 tells us that Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion. The disciples woke him and said to him, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" Jesus was asleep in the back of the boat. See, we can't forget that Christ, the Emmanuel, God with us, He was all God and all man all at the same time. Which means, as the all-man part of Him, He would have had all the physical experiences and limitations that you and I have. The Bible shows us that there were times when Jesus was hungry. There were times when He was thirsty. There was times when He was tired. There was obviously, in this case, a time He needed to sleep. So even though He's all God all the time, He is the presence of God in the form of a man. God brought Him to earth in the form of a man, so He was all man also at the same time. So in this particular case, they had been teaching, He had been speaking, and probably for many hours, because the way the crowds came to hear Him speak, it was very likely that He would have to share the same teaching numerous times. There was no public address systems in that day to broadcast His voice. So if the crowd was huge, He would teach to one section of the crowd, and then He would have to move to another section and teach again, and then maybe teach again. So in this particular case, Jesus is weary. And as I said a moment ago, the Sea of Galilee is known for these sudden and violent storms. As you saw in the picture, that tranquil body of water, that peaceful looking body of water, can become very treacherous in just a moment. And in this particular case, that is exactly what happened. This was no ordinary storm. This storm had a rage possibly like few others that these men experienced. As I said, a lot of the disciples were fishermen by trade. They were used to being out on the waters when it got rough. But for whatever reason, this particular storm was particularly dangerous and violent. So much so that these experienced fishermen became afraid. So the rage of the storm is very symbolic to the situations that have come into our lives. When situations enter into our world that are unlike anything else that we've ever experienced. We've been through tough times. We've been through storms before, but every once in a while one will come and it is just particularly violent. It's a little more intense than any of the others. And you've walked that path. You've walked that journey. And if you haven't, someday it will find you. If you haven't had a bad experience, look out, because it's out there and it will find you one day. This particular storm was significantly more dangerous than anything. A great example of what can happen to us when we're tossed by the storms of life. The disciples lost sight of a couple very important things as they began to fear for their lives. Number one, many of them had been down this road before and didn't remember that they'd been through a storm before. And secondly, many of them knew what to do, but they weren't doing it. They became afraid. They became talking among themselves about what was going on, and they began asking questions. Doesn't Jesus care that we're about to perish? They knew what to do, they just weren't doing it at that point. I like this illustration about Chippy the parakeet. Chippy the parakeet never saw it coming. One second he was peacefully perched in his cage. The next he was sucked in, washed up, and blown over. The problems began when Chippy's owner decided to clean Chippy's cage with the vacuum cleaner. She removed the attachment from the end of the hose and stuck it in the cage. The phone rang, and she turned to pick it up. Right there, there's your problem. The phone rang. She barely said hello when Chippy got sucked in. The bird owner was horrified and gasped, put down the phone, turned off the vacuum, and opened the bag. There was Chippy, still alive, but stunned. Since the bird was covered with dust and soot, she grabbed him and raced to the bathroom, turned on the faucet, and helped Chippy under the freezing cold water. Then, realizing that Chippy was soaked and shivering, she did what any compassionate bird owner would do. She reached for the hairdryer and blasted the pet with hot air. Poor Chippy never knew what hit him. A few days after the trauma, the reporter who had initially written about the event contacted Chippy's owner to see how the bird was doing. Well, she replied, Chippy doesn't say much anymore. He just sits and stares. It's not hard to see why. Sucked in, washed up, and blown over. That's enough to steal the song from the stoutest heart. Maybe that's how you feel today. You see, all of us have had these experiences. All of us have been left where a situation, an event in our life has stolen the song from our hearts, stolen the joy and the peace from our lives, taken it away from us. That situation was as bad as anything we've ever had. And we don't know why it's happening. And we begin to question God. And we're upset with the Lord because He didn't show up right there that minute, that second that it was going on. And He didn't stop it the minute we wanted it stopped. We get upset. We begin to ask questions. As we see this morning, that storm's rage was violent and intense. And it made the disciples question the presence of Christ. Secondly, I want us to consider a faithless reaction. We see that the storm had rage. Next, we see a faithless reaction. In verse 38, Scripture says that Jesus was in the stern sleeping on a cushion. The disciples woke him and said to him, Teacher, don't you care if we drown? These guys gave over to their fear. And before we're too hard on them, we do the same thing. We've done the same thing. We've looked to God and say, God, don't you know what I'm experiencing? Don't you know what I'm going through? Do you not care what I'm going through? We begin to ask these questions. These guys weren't behaving like men who had been closer to Jesus than anyone. Think about what these guys saw Jesus do up to this point. This is well into His earthly ministry. They've seen amazing things. They've seen Jesus do unbelievable things. None of those guys should have doubted for a minute that He had the ability and the power to step in and take care of them. Yet they're fearful and they ask questions. These guys weren't behaving like men who saw miracles from the Son of God. From this moment on, their focus was on the problem and not on its solution. And sometimes we spend a lot of time in the problem. We spend a lot of time focused on the situation and the issue at hand, and we don't look to the solution. And they give in to doubt and they question Jesus when they ask Him, Don't you care? We're about to drown. What a question. These guys should have known better, if anyone would have known better. Just as they were then, we are reminded now that we're not made to be afraid. You say, where does that say that in the Bible, that we're not supposed to be afraid? 2 Timothy chapter 1 and verse 7 is exactly where you find that verse. For the Spirit of God gave us. The Spirit God gave us does not make us timid, but gives us power, love, and self-discipline. Other translations of the Bible would say that the Spirit of God did not give us a spirit of fear. What that means is you are not made to stay in fear. Now, it's a natural thing to be startled, to be scared, to be concerned, to be worried, to be anxious. We all have those feelings. But it's never been God's intention for you to live in that and stay in that. It's never been His will for you to stay mired in fear and in doubt, because He didn't give you that spirit. He gave you a spirit of power, which means you have the ability to overcome these things through Him, of love and of a sound mind, as we see in this verse. We were not made to be afraid. We were made to demonstrate power in the midst of weakness and limitations, to have self-discipline when things are spinning out of control. These disciples had nothing to fear for one simple reason, and that was that Jesus was nearby. They had no reason to fear because the answer was in the back of the boat. Next, let's consider this morning the Savior's rebuke. They wake Jesus up. He finally decides to get up and take care of what's going on in front of them. In verses 39 and 40, he got up. He rebuked the wind and said to the waves, "Quiet, be still." Then the wind died down and it was completely calm. He said to his disciples, "Why are you so afraid?" And that last question, that second question, is so telling in that verse. Do you still have no faith? Where does that question come from? That question is a product of him saying, all these things that we've done together, all these things that you've witnessed, the miracles, the healing, all the demonstration of God's power, do you still have no faith even after you've seen these things? You can't miss the significance of Jesus' word choice here. Simply put, Jesus meant business and he was making a point, because when he told the waves to be quiet and be still, that's the same language he used when he silenced and drove out demons in the four Gospels. That's the same word choice for them to be silenced and to be immovable and to not move and to no longer have any power. That's the same language he used there. He was meaning business. Whatever it is that we're afraid of, Christ came to serve us in our time of need and bring us peace and deliverance. A big part of the reason Jesus went to the cross was to bring you peace and to bring me deliverance. That was a big part of the reason that he died on the cross, so that we don't have to live in fear. We don't have to believe the situation is bad and it's never going to get better, or we're never going to be removed from it. In verse 40, he said to his disciples, "Why are you so afraid?" This rebuke, Jesus wasn't mad at them, as more he was disappointed in them. And he's asking them, why are you fearful? Why are you afraid? Do you still have no faith after you've seen what I've done? After you've heard the things I've said? Why are you so fearful? Jesus rebukes the wind and the waves, and then he rebukes his followers, the disciples. You see, the storm did not disrupt Jesus. Think about that for a minute. Who was the only one that wasn't bothered by the storm? Jesus was the one that was sleeping in the boat. He was the one that was not concerned. Don't forget, it was Jesus' idea for them to get in the boat and to row out to the middle of the Sea of Galilee. He put them in that situation because they needed this situation. And you and I get put into situations by God because we need that situation. We need that experience. It was Jesus' idea all along. So the one person that's not bothered by the storm is the one who's sleeping in the boat. A lack of faith, because they didn't believe his word, disappointed Jesus. A lack of faith because they accused Jesus of a lack of care for them, disappointed Jesus. And a lack of faith because they forgot the big picture. They should have known that God the Father was not going to have the Messiah die in a storm. The Son of Man was not going to perish in the sea. Lastly, I want us to consider the disciples' reaction. After the wind and the waves have calmed themselves, after the storm had ceased, the disciples' reaction, in verse 41, they were terrified and asked each other, "Who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him." The scary part was over. The sea is now calm. Yet the disciples are still fearful. Other scripture translates that verse this way: they feared exceedingly. I like those words because we too are guilty of fearing in excess. We're afraid too much. We're afraid too long. And they were still fearful. And then they asked a good question, who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him. Who is this? Even in the powerful demonstration that Jesus just did in front of them, they wanted to know who he was. Who is this man that even the wind and the waves obey him? Psalm chapter 89, verses 8 and 9 tell us who Jesus is. Who is like you, Lord God Almighty? Because remember, Jesus was the presence of God in the form of man. Who is like you, Lord God Almighty? You, Lord, are mighty, and your faithfulness surrounds you. You rule over the surging sea. When its waves mount up, you still them. That's who Jesus is. That's the reason you can have peace when you're afraid. There is nothing wrong with being afraid. It is a natural quality and characteristic that you've been given, that I've been given, and it does manifest itself at times in our lives. It's okay to be startled and afraid and concerned, but it is not okay to stay there. Because Psalm verse 89 reminds us, you rule over the raging sea. When its waves mount up, you still them. Why was Jesus sleeping? When he knew full well a storm was raging around him. All you have to do is think back to when you were a kid in school. And remember this. The teacher is always quiet during the test. That's why we think God is missing. That's why we think that he's checked out. That's why if we can't see him and hear him, we don't think he's involved, or we don't even think he's there. Don't forget that when you were a kid in school, you remember that the teacher was always quiet during the test. The teacher didn't give answers during the test. That'd be a great test if the teacher stood up there and said, okay, here we go. The answer to number 1 is this. The answer to number 2 is false. That would be a great test. We all would take a test like that. But some of us don't want that kind of test. We want all the answers. But when we're struggling, and when we're afraid, and we're fearful, we cannot forget that during the test, the teacher is always quiet during the test. So this morning, whatever it is that you are struggling with, you may have come in here today and you've got your best Sunday morning face on this morning. You don't want anybody to know what's going on. You're afraid of something. Something that's shaking you up. And you're fearful. You have doubts. You have questions. You think God is missing. But this morning, let me remind you that the solution is closer than you think. The disciples had the solution to their problem in the back of the boat, and all they had to do was go and find their solution. So this morning, I challenge you, go find your solution. Find the one who can help you. Pray this morning that God would give you a powerful mind, that he would give you self-discipline, that he would give you self-control, that he would give you all the things that he promises you to encounter these things and to overcome them and be victorious. Go find your solution, because the solution is closer than you might think this morning. This kind of comes this morning as we have a moment together to listen as she plays. This is a great time for you to seek the Lord and say, Lord, you know exactly what's going on in my life. You know exactly what is pushing my buttons right now. You know exactly what is making me afraid. This is what I'm scared of. And this morning, ask the Lord to rise up and speak to the storm and speak to the raging wind and tell it to be quiet and to be still. The solution is closer than you think.